and a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Center for Governance. We are here with the fourth session of the Banyan Tree event series on governance theory and practice. And today we have Dr. Amar here with us to help us understand the nuances and complexities of farmer-producer organizations in the light of network governance and system sciences. Without further ado, I'd like to call upon Professor Deva Prasad to introduce our key speaker of the session. So, Professor, over to you.
Thank you, Nidya. So, hope I'm audible to all of you. Yeah. So, today we have with us Dr. Amar Nayak. Dr. Amar Nayak is a professor of strategic management and chairperson, Center for Sustainable Ecological Systems at Xavier's Institute of Management, Bhubaneswar. He has been the NABARD chair professor for 2 terms. He was a full professor of management and director of Center for Sustainable Community Systems, Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration during 2014 and 15 period. Also, significant note that Professor Nayak has played active role in the national FPO policy formulation. So, Professor Nayak would be sharing with us his knowledge as his experience on the topic of farmer-producer organization, a system's view to the network governance. We are all eager to hear how we need to look from a policy and governance perspective, and an effective design and structure need to be developed for FPOs so that FPOs actually stay relevant for today's world. So over to you, Professor Nayak. We can take over. I hope you can actually share the slides also.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Deva, Nitya, and the Center for Governance. And welcome to all the participants of this seminar or talk or deliberation, whatever we may name it. It's a great privilege to be with you all and share some of this understanding. And I hope the next 40 minutes, 1 hour will be useful for all of you. In whatever field you are there, I think it may have some value to you. So let's go ahead with the presentation. Let me see if I can get it right there. So yeah, I guess you can see the
yes,
slide there. Now, the title is Farmer-Producer Organizations, a Systems View to Network Governance. There are several terms there, and many within the, business schools or normal institutions would not have a very deep understanding of each of them. And it's in understanding those terms very clearly that we can understand governance. And it's what we are doing is, or I'm going to do is, I'm going to take you through the lens of system science, a very specific aspect of system science, which I call as the all interacting, evolving system science perspective. So system science itself is new to many, and within that, I'm going to look at a very specific framework called the AIESS framework. But as we go along, I think some of these points will get clear, but let me start off by asking some basic questions and see how it is understood. Can I move forward? Yeah, so let us look at some basics to the network governance for an FPO. First of all, what is an FPO? It is a farmer-producer organization. The question arises that what do you mean by farmer? What do you mean by producer? And what do you mean by organization here? Organization is easy for all of us to understand. Any kind of organization, whether it is a for-profit organization or a not-for-profit organization or a community organization, it's a notion of organization. So a cooperative is also an organization. An SHG also is an informal organization. If it is registered, of course, it will become. Or a farmers club also is an organization, or an organization has the basic features of any organizations are the same. So it's, of course, we need to distinguish here. It is not an institution. it is an organization. That clarity we have. So now why it is called a farmer producer? Who is a farmer? The general understanding of farmer is that he must be growing something in the farm. Whereas the international definition of farmer includes fishermen, craftspeople, any hunter, gatherer, anyone who engages directly with the nature. So even a bricklayer is a producer. So farmer producer. So it's there's a thin line between farmer and producer actually includes all those who are involved directly in with nature, engage with some activity with nature. So here the word is very important to know, because this is important in defining who can become member of an FPO. What kind of an FPO can you have? Should you have only farming activities? Can the fishermen not make a FPO? Can goat rearers not become an FPO? Can bricklayers not become FPO? Yes, they can become FPO. So this notion of what an FPO is important to first take account of. The second is, what is the purpose of an FPO? You know, that's again a very important distinction to make, which will help in correctly designing an FPO and deciding the objective of an FPO, the activities of an FPO. So one is one can see FPO as a transaction unit, which is just supposed to be like a trading entity and just collect material from the farmers and supply it to a trader and put it in the value chain, the international business value chain of any item. So that's one idea of the purpose of an FPO. This second is to also see whether it can become a kind of an institution, not just an organization, but an institution, very significant role that it plays in a community. Or is it a commonly held enterprise system? Is it a community enterprise system? So what is the notion of FPO? That's another important understanding, to be able to actually then see what kind of a design, what kind of an architecture, what kind of a network, and how it needs to be governed internally and externally. So these are important points to bring into the table before understanding what should be the network governance for an FPO and what will work, why it is probably not working so far or not working as well as you want it to work. So unless these basics are clarified, it becomes really a little confusing subsequently to deal with it. Then the third part is again a very important part, especially for management institutions, to make this distinction, because all the while we deal with value chains. But now the question is, do we look at value chains or value networks? So what do we mean by value? How do we create value? Do we create value in a long linear chain, or we create in horizontal networks? So that's another, these are all interesting questions, even those of you who are doing research. And these are actually, you know, I think that these are like gold mines for research. When you make this distinction, you will have a different understanding of the reality. So what is it? Is it a value chain? Do you create value in the chain for an FPO, or you create value in a network when you have a horizontal network, or what you call the circular economies? That is the latest models that you're seeing. So then, of course, any business strategy or any management strategy cannot but have to look at the context. So context of an FPO, in what context does it operate? What are its internal context? What are its external context? What are the characteristics of its members? What are the characteristics of its production system? What are the characteristics of the markets? What are the characteristics of the intermediaries? And what is the characteristics of the institutions, rules, regulations, policy, and the overall governance structure? All these influence the entity. This is where you bring in the systems way of looking at a problem, and not just look at the problem independent of the other subsystems that exist. So how do we understand the context of an FPO? And it is if you can solve the problems of an FPO, you can very easily solve the problems of an MNC. The context is very, very complex for an farmer producer organizations. So that's the power of researching on FPOs. If you can solve problem of an FPO, you can solve problem of industrial organizations. It is a fraction of the problem that you encounter in industrial organizations. You will realize soon why it is so. What are the complexities of an FPO, and how, if you compare it to an industrial organization, is actually a fraction of those complexities. So the fifth part, or another way, or the next way to actually understand these issues, is to also see why is FPOs have become significant. What is its significance? I mean, what is its role? Why do we need this? What has been the policy framework in the government? What has been the practice in India? What has been the practice all over the world? What is happening in Germany, for example, with regard to organizations and enterprises? What kind of organizations actually serve communities and societies more than the others? So, and of course, we will also like to see the performance of FPO so far. That's also something that you want to know. If it is performing well, then we don't need to do much of work there. But if it is not performing so well, then there is scope for improvement and there is scope for working there. So what's the performance so far is also something that I will, of course, touch on. But yeah, these are ways of trying to understand. So then comes, obviously, when you have looking at these possible contradictions, you would actually try to see what are the design characteristics of different subsystems, whether you see in terms of a value chain or whether you see in terms of a network. There are different subsystems. For instance, the value chain that you can think of is, I'll show you shortly, subsequently, but there are different entities in the overall value chain in which the FPO is part of that value chain or the network. And what are the characteristics of, or the design characteristics, or the present characteristics in terms of the design in different subsystems? Now, the issue here is, if there are internal contradictions between different subsystems, you know it will not work, or it will be suboptimal. So it's important to see that they're technically compatible in different subsystems for getting the maximum output. So therefore it's necessary to see what are the design characteristics. We'll touch on some of this as we go along. Some of them will be dealt with more with a little more rigor than the other, because we have a limited time. I think we have how much? 45 minutes, 1 hour?
Yes, Professor. We have around 45 minutes. Please take your time. No problem.
So at the end of 30 minutes, you please warn me,
Sure.
because I can go on and on. Too many things are there for discussion. The seventh point for one to actually get into this domain is to see the need for systems view. In other words, in one of the significant problems of our governance today or public policy today is convergence. We are not able to converge. Multiple departments doing multiple things, but they are not able to converge. All the departments, all governments would like to have convergence, but they are not able to converge on the ground. Now, that's where, often you think that, in fact, it goes back very long back to Aristotle, talking about this point of the whole is always, the individual components will not make the whole. The whole is always more than the combination of individual entities. So it's necessary to see, because of some assumptions, for instance, if they are connected with each other, then the natural point is that you need to see them together if you want the maximum output, or see that it is sustainable. Otherwise, due to internal contradictions, the system will not perform. For instance, this simple communication that we are having, I have my analog voice, which is going to this machine, which is digitized, and it goes to some station, and then it moves from that station to somewhere in Kozhikode, another station or satellite, and then to Kozhikode, and then from there it goes to your machine. Then that gets that digital signal is converted to analog signal. Now, if at any of the equipment that we have are not compatible, then the communication would fail. It's as simple as that. So if this is the kind of connectivity or connection that exists, if they are not compatible at one point, it will not function. So that is the issue that we need to look at. It's not only the case with FPOs, but with any other business entity or organization or any other system that's operating. So there is a need for a systems view to understanding even FPOs, and in that sense, then the governance issues. Then, of course, if you think that they are connected in some way, then the natural question is the relevance of system science. What does system science say? What does the basic principle of system science lead to? That would give us an idea on how do we design FPO, how do we design the architecture or network of the governance system for the FPOs. So all these, they have to be compatible with each other, and what is the design characteristics and in the subsequent subsystems. So I'll discuss a little more on this as we go in. Of course, the last part which I want to take you to, and this is what I have learned over the last about 20 years, looking at first studying, of course, my first, I must have spent nearly 20 years studying multinational companies. And then in the last 15 years, I have been looking at these small collectives, the FPOs, and looking at their many aspects of the FPOs. So taking that into account, I would think there is a perspective that might help in resolving these contradictions. I won't be able to, this is a full theory by itself. I won't be able to deliberate much, but I'll give you a brief on what this is in the subsequent, towards the end. So this is called the all interacting, evolving system science perspective. So there is systems view is necessary, system science needs to be understood, and there is a very specific characteristic through which it probably can be resolved. That is the all interacting, evolving system science. In fact, the last, my recent book with Professor Kakani on critical perspective on public systems management in India, which was published in last year by Routledge, has 2 chapters. One chapter, chapter 2 is discussing this all interacting, evolving system science perspective. And chapter 6 actually gives you the solution to the topic that we have today, the governance architecture. Of course, along with that, many other things that needs to be looked at, along with SDG goals and so on and so forth. So these 2 chapters would actually complement today's discussion, or today's discussion could be an introduction to understanding further. And for those of you who want to know more, can look at those 2 chapters, and it will give, of course, there are many other resources to look at, but this is at one place and one connection with I Am Cozy Code, where Professor Kakani has been a co-author to this book. And if we understood these 9 steps, which will take us some time, it may not happen, we may get an insight today. But if you understood up to point 9, then it becomes easy to develop the network governance for an FPO. So the first 9 steps are necessary, at least 9 steps are necessary to reason out, to see what is scientifically, which is sustainable network governance for an FPO. Now, let me take you through some of the concerns. Now, the complexities that you will see. This is if you see the value chain risks to farmers, and you can see the activities of the farmers. You can see these are the activities that you can think of. The farmer needs credit, requires agricultural inputs, land preparation is the next step, then on-farm crop animal management, post-harvest is an activity, value addition, marketing, and then of course, hoping that he'll have income. And that has been the target of the present government, saying doubling farmers' income by 2022. It has not happened. Now, despite all the efforts, it has not happened. So that's another performance that you can think. It's in terms of, in general, it's not that governments have not worked, but there are many technical, just like the technical contradictions between one subsystems to the other subsystems. And this is where the role of academics do come in, scholarship come in. And if we are not able to provide at least clarity, we can't expect policy to function. So, but before even credit, there's one point mentioned there, local institution. That has been what has been observed for the last almost several decades by the Planning Commission, that unless you have a local institution at the grassroots level, no amount of public policy and investment would actually be able to hold the investment. That has been the general understanding over several decades as to why this kind of entities are becoming important. That's going to the point of significance of FPO. How can an FPO become or take the role of a local institution for the producers or farmers? Now look at the risks. Those are just the points that you saw, but you look at the risks. And then this risk is divided into two categories of clusters. One is the irrigated cluster. The other is a rain-fed cluster. Now, if you look at the risk, this is very interesting. The risks are not same all over. The risk for irrigated farmers is not in credit. The risk of irrigated farmers in the irrigated farm areas, the risk is in protecting the animals from the harvest. This is what you saw as an issue in UP. Free grazing animals. You can see how much significant it is. Rain-fed risk is probably that's the highest in terms of value addition is one, but that's also one of the highest that you see here. Credit is not a risk, whereas when it comes down to rain-fed, the credit risk is pretty high in the rain-fed areas. Whereas the post-harvest or the other risk, that is taking care of the animal, is further a problem. In fact, in the irrigated areas, there are no cattle, the machinery. They use machinery. But when it comes to animals, taking care of the farm after the crop is sown, or the seeds are sown and crop is grown, you see the risk is very high. That is because of the free grazing animals. So the kind of risk that you find is, first of all, there are risks all over, and the risks are different in different locations. And the overall risk, if you see the risk of people in the tribal areas, I hope you can see the risk of people in the tribal areas is actually far higher than people in the irrigated areas. So that's another understanding of who are at more risk than the other. Averaging it out, it's looking that the risk is, overall risk is lesser for farmers in irrigated as compared to rain-fed. Now, this is what the government has been doing for the last almost 40, 45 years, since the 1960s, 70s. It has tried everything possible. It has been providing credit, it has been providing marketing support, livelihood support, NRM, watershed, rural infrastructure. It has done everything that it can do. But and it gives to individual, village, GP at different, mostly it is targeted at the individual farmer. But what you see is if the price of an item of a produce is X at the farm gate, the price of that today will be far higher, be 4X to 6 or 8X at the retail outlet. So what the farmer gets and what the consumer, both are losing. The farmer is losing and the consumer is also losing. Consumer is paying far higher than what possibly he could pay, and the farmer is getting far lesser than what he could. Most of the money is lost in the middle. So you take any item, you will see this. So this is also an opportunity for business entrepreneurs to look at where is the scope of business, if you want to see that way. And therefore, if you see today in international business, the largest trading is not in commodities. It is in agricultural produce. So that's empirical evidence to say why so much of interest in investments and interest in agriculture. You may be surprised to know that who is the biggest investor in agriculture as an individual is Bill Gates. And most of the software giants or entrepreneurs in the US are buying up land in the US. Facebook, Google, Apple, all Microsoft, everyone is after land. And the highest investment in R&D is by Bill Gates and Melinda Foundation. So it's not that they want to serve in one sense, but there's a huge opportunity that they're seeing as business. So now you also get a sense of how the market dynamics are working at the international level, and of course it gets down to local level. So as an economist, you may say price discovery. How will price discovery occur if these big giants are already eyeing these markets or these producers? So, so there are a lot of complexities. That's what I said. If you can solve the problem of a farmer and an FPO, you would solve the problem of a corporation, large corporation, very easily. So that's the kind of complexity that you would soon, I'll at least expose you to some of it now. Now, subsequently, the effort is also, can we get the companies to get linked? So ITC eChopal is an example. So connect them to farmers, hopefully it'll help. Or Fab India in the textile. All these are not really benefiting majority of the farmers. They are only benefiting 2%, 3% of the large farmers or large, fabric or textile maker or large weavers. So I won't go further into it. There are other papers to look at it, but basically you have seen that from individual, we went into SHGs, self-help groups, common interest groups, CIGs, cooperative societies, producer companies, NGOs, MFIs, contract farming, and industrial organization through PPP mode. Basically saying, okay, and then that's gradually moved to connecting them to large corporations. So this is the structure that we have made an effort, but none of this is increasing the income of the farmer. So what's the problem? How do I get this network fixed? How do I develop this system fixed? Are the questions. So even you can see here NRLM, which is the biggest, which has played the biggest role in poverty alleviation in the country. You can see that they have also gone back to this idea of institutional platform of poor. There need to be a platform where the people in the community can transact, which can be with them. So that's the general notion and understanding in terms of how we could solve this problem. There is an understanding of need for a local institution, but no kind of arrangement is actually solving the problem. That is the key. That's the area where I'd rather here request management scholars. It will not pay you much to work in FPOs, but the problems are very severe. And if you can only devote time to understand and resolve these problems. So that's how your national policy guidelines for 10,000 FPOs has come about in 2020. So the significance is understood. The importance of the institutional platform or organization at community level is recognized. And that is how we have come about with this situation of a policy guideline for 10,000 FPOs in 2020. But it has a longer history, as I said. We started with cooperatives in 1904. It's an old initiative. We have over 1 lakh of primary cooperatives, primary agricultural cooperative society. Almost 96,000 to 1 lakh cooperatives already exist. In 2002, this initiative was made for producer companies, FPOs as producer companies. It was initiated. To 2003, the amendment came in. FPOs to be registered as producer companies under Companies Act 1956, Section 9A, if you want to look at more. If you look at the characteristics, this is under Companies Act, but the characteristics of this producer company is the characteristics of a cooperative, which is a beginning of 1904. So the same effort has continued again. And 2013, the government of India, the Ministry of Agriculture, or Department of Agriculture actually came up with a policy guideline in 2013 by SFAC. You can look at that, it's there in the open source. And then, of course, that was a policy guideline. And then 2020 came, we came up with the scheme. 2013 was a policy. 2020 became a scheme, so a guideline. And of course, in this period from 2009 onwards or 2012 onwards, NABARD has come in as a big player in promoting farmer-producer organizations. In fact, the term FPO actually is coined by NABARD, which is actually relevant because it captures all forms of organization. They had tried with farmer clubs, they had tried with SHGs first, then farmer clubs, then SCIGs, then FIGs, then different forms of interest groups, various forms of interest groups, and finally come to FPOs. So it initiated with its own funds from 2012 onwards. They actually funded me with a small support, research support in 2009 when the research had begun. As a how do you design FPOs? And the details are there in our center's website. A lot of readings are available. Those of you who are interested can look up that. I think I'm missing out something. Is there something more? Yeah, so the performance, the other part of this is the performance of these FPOs, because it's not 2020, but the initiative started from 2002 onwards. 2002 to 2012 was very slow, but 2013 onwards, there has been large number of FPOs in the country. Almost today, we may have about 7,000 FPOs already. But the performance, we have done 2 rounds of studies across the country. The performance is not very encouraging. The rate of success or rate of performance is less than the performance of SHGs. SHGs 25% perform, and FPOs is more complex animal. The rate would further go down. There are a handful of FPOs that I can think are sustainable in the Indian context of the thousands of FPOs that we have. So what's the problem? And I can see the way, of course, the policy I was responsible in designing the policy, but there's one factor which has, to my mind, has killed the policy. One factor, everything else they kept, but one factor, they made an error. And if that is not understood carefully, it can again disrupt the intent. So these are the complications that you will see, that you can have most of the features in place, but if you make one factor, if the design of one of the factors is misplaced, performance of the FPOs or collectives in general has not been good. And I guess the real culprit is here, or the real issue is out here. If you look at the issues of farmer, we said they have high risks. We saw that they have risk at all points of their value creation process. But if you look at the externality, again, the issues are very, these are technical issues. There's nothing to do with any other issues. While they encounter both the monsters of market as well as monsoon, they also have now other issues. Culture of agriculture has changed, the health and education costs have increased, and children are not staying in agriculture, they are moving out of agriculture. So migration has been large over the years. Now, if you look at the characteristics of the small producers, now among the farmers, 92 or over 92% of the farmers are small and marginal producers. There is a small segment which is rich and large. We don't have to worry about them. They know how to handle. And there is also a segment, a very small segment, which is poor, vulnerable. They need emergency feeding. They will. It's very difficult to hold them. So now we are only referring to these issues of these small and marginal farmers who form the bulk of the segment, who can actually get to this poor and vulnerable category. That's the risk the society faces. Management schools also need some responsibility on this, not just work for the other end of the value creation process. So this is where our role comes in, and of course the government knows the significance of this in that context. It's not only votes, but also many other, you don't get skilled manpower to your industries if this segment will fall down. And you know the relationship between growth in agriculture and growth in industry. There's a direct correlation between the two. So it's not that it's a separate entity. We shouldn't be bothered about that. I think argument is not an issue to be dealt with. It is understood. Now, if you look at the characteristics of the small and marginal producers, they have this in this green color I've shown. They do best when they are biodiverse, when their product portfolio is biodiverse. They are integrated in agriculture that adopt economies of scope. Whereas the global competitive commodity markets are efficient on other principles. They are efficient when they go for scale, when they go for economies of scale.
I think the slide I think you're referring to is not put on the, it's not yet.
Okay. Are you able to see?
Yes, yes,
yeah?
we can see now.
So when you look at this green circle that represents, let's say, the farmers, they do best when they have biodiverse product portfolio and they do engage in integrated agriculture, and then they basically are adopting, or we encourage them to do the economies of scope approach. So that's the way they survive, or they have survived for thousands of years. When you look at, and this is now, of course, globally, it has been, if you look at agroecology, the global literature on agroecology, this would prove the same point. When you look at the markets, when you look at the global markets, global competitive commodity markets operate on another set of principles. They work on economies of scale, they work on specialization, they work on large capital, and they work on intensive technology. That is the basis of competitiveness for them. Now you can clearly see these two are opposite to each other. In other words, they're technically incompatible. So what companies do is ask them to go the way they design. And if you now, I hope you can relate this to farmers' unrest on the three farm laws. Is not unfounded. They have not expressed this way, but they can understand from their experience. So the characteristics of the markets that we have today is technically opposite to the characteristics which make them survive. This, I would think, is the real challenge. Now, if these were the challenge, then how do you deal with it? How do you actually build bridges between the two? What are those couplers that you will use to connect one with the other? That is where the role of FPO comes in. That's where the role of FPO comes in. Between these two circles, which are opposite to each other. Now, if this FPO is determined by the market, you know consequences. This is where management science is required. Because we do study organizations, we study designs of organizations. And if you don't, if we go by industrial organization model, then we are basically killing an important sector. Once you are able to design this entity, then the issue of governance network comes in. How do I actually have the technical consistency in the other points of the connection subsystems? So that's, I think, is the point. And typically there are many contradictions in our thinking. For instance, if you think of these critical pillars of an FPO, all these are critical pillars. They depend on this in some way or the other. But our understanding of them, as in typical classical economics, is that they are independent of each other. And that's how we design, that's how we study, and that's how we do things. They're independent of each other. In reality, they're actually interconnected. So now if you look at the literature Professor Deva and Nitya sent me, the literature from Powell is talking about trust. The literature is talking about interconnections, relationships. it's not explored in this manner, but the heart of the problem has been identified. Ostrom, if you look at Ostrom's work, it all refers to these aspects. It's at the core of it is the relationships, which is based on trust. If that becomes a vacuum, then the rest of it, like SHG, will only be 10% efficient, 20% efficient, and not more. Any of the collectives, for that matter, will not. Now the challenging point is, how do we establish internal technical consistency across these different layers? Until we achieve that, we can keep spending money, get consultancy fee, and do a good income out of the whole process, and everyone is happy with whatever is happening. So this is the scholar's work. How do we actually find or determine the technical consistency across these different layers that we have, which are embedded layers, interlocked layers in an ecosystem? And FPO is one part of that system. FPO, organized referring to here, is only one aspect of this network system, embedded system. It is embedded into this ecosystem. Now I'll take you to the situation where you see it is far more complex. Look at these issues. When you think of an organization, whether it's an MNC or whether it's an FPO or whether it's an SHG, you can see how they are determined: size, scope, technology, ownership, and management. Size, you can be very small or you can be very large, like the largest company in the world. You can have multiple activities to engage with, or you can have specialized only in electric cars, or only in petrochemicals, or like a farmer doing everything, starting from animal husbandry to horticulture to field crops to vegetables, fruits, and all that. So all kinds of activities. So that's your economies of scope or economies of scale, what you are looking at. Technology, it can be very simple, can be extensive or intensive. In other words, ownership can be common, it can be private, so property rights, where do you place the property rights? Management can be simple, non-hierarchical to extremely hierarchical. So you can have this kind of feature. If you take these, the middle ones as factors, they create multiple possibilities of where they stand, each of these points stands. If you look at Ostrom again, at least 3 of our variables relate to size. One variable, of course, is property rights. So if then looking at that, then you see, okay, how are we talking about, what kind of networks are we talking about? Why are we talking about these kind of networks? The question becomes simple to understand. So, of course, even Ostrom doesn't explain in this manner. She has, from her empirical evidences, she noticed that smaller sizes are better. So here, the size only not refer to number of people in an collective, but it is also referring to the size of geography. If you look at my previous book, it has details of that. What does size really mean? In fact, one of my PhD students two, 3 years ago, he finished his thesis on size. Just size, the issue of size. That is, and if you look at the reviews or the literature, or rather what you call the expert panel studying cooperatives, there have been 25 studies so far since 1904. And at least 3 studies of those expert committees have talked about this size. Small is better. And go back to Schumacher, small is beautiful. The economists. So there are this to look at. Each of these is a very, very complex factor to study. And of course, now you can see, if you take features on the left-hand side, you create an MNC. If you create a feature on the right-hand side, it becomes an SHG. Now you have to find an optimal point for FPO. Obviously, these points are not on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side. The details, of course, we don't have time in today's session. We look at governance. These are the common features of governance, whether it is in the community level, at the national level, or whether it at the collective level. Some of the keys, if you think of relationships, is to look at frequency of interactions. What is the kind of decision-making method? What is the problem-solving approach? How is the arrangement for resource dependency or independency? And of course, with that will follow what should be the governance architecture. Governance architecture is not independent of the other things. The architecture has to support or be consistent with other design issues. So if you take this further, it gets to this situation. Again, two spectrum of these factors. It can be frequency, can be low. Now the subsequent takes his own call. The BDO tells this is to be done, so he does it. And the order comes from the DM, so he does it. Or in a collective, the president and secretary decide. You ask people in villages, who does the primary cooperative belong to? Very often in Orissa, I've heard people saying it belongs to the president. So that's the kind of present setting that you have. So frequency of interaction, whether it is in an enterprise, or if you think of an organization, a management institute, where the dean takes all the decision and doesn't consult the professors. There are no meetings. There are no faculty council meetings. So the logic applies to all entities. So frequency of interaction can be taken as an important factor. Decision-making method can be indirect to direct. Problem solving can be positivist to constructivist. Positivist basically saying that I know it all, there is one correct answer. So there's a philosophical position that one can further explore. Resource dependency can be external. We depend on outside. We depend on the central government funds. We depend on the state government funds to run our enterprise, to run our community, or you generate internal resources. So 15th Finance Commission on Panchayati Raj was basically saying, can you generate your own resources? Can the FPO become self-reliant after 5 years of support? What are the sources of resources? How do you actually design? Now, if it is determined always from top, it is difficult to actually generate resources. So all these gets impacted. If you choose one dimension, one factor on one side, it will make the problems for you on the other side. And all these when set, the governance architecture also becomes simple. Do you say it is an unbounded? It can be as big as it can be, or it is bounded. What should be the size of this network? Where does it end? Or there is no end? Or there is strong ties at some level, weak ties at some other level. So the several issues of this kind comes down. Let me move faster. I think these are the complexities that you can see here. More number of factors I've introduced, almost 40 factors, and the combination gets us to a situation. If you do system modeling, there are infinite possibilities of failure. That is why the world has still not found a problem for agriculture. The world, not just India. Farmers are committing suicide in US, in New Zealand, in Britain, in Ireland, in Australia. There may be fewer, but they are. That's why I said, if you can solve problem of agriculture, solving problem of a company is very simple. This is the challenge for management scholars, to pitch in your energy to find if you can find a solution. And our challenge or our limitation is we are trained to think on features on the left-hand side. We are not trained to think on the features on the right-hand side. And the sociologists, though they understand this is true, but they have not codified it systematically. And therefore, we put them as activists. So that's the gap we have in scholarship. And how can we communicate to policy if we ourselves are not clear? What we are suggesting are just against the natural principles. This is when I said, look at need for systems view is about connections, is about coordination, is about convergence. I will not spend more time. I think Professor Deva has been looking at his watch and I should wind it up soon. The relevance of system science, you know, it basically says the strength of a chain is strength of the weakest link. So in your network, what is the priority? Where are the strong ties and where are the weak ties? Those are the ways to design the networks. Within the entity, where do you prioritize? And within the network, who do you prioritize? And of course, I take you to a very specific perspective of system science, which is the one that is there in chapter 2 of that book I referred to. There are other places also where I referred to, but it's actually drawing from the nature of nature. The nature of nature, there's a separate paper on that, which compares physical sciences, natural sciences, social sciences, economics, management, cybernetics. And the common thing across all these subjects is that it all talks about uncertainty. That is constant. Whether it starts from Heisenberg uncertainty principle or VUCA that we teach in management school, or you take any other field, whether it is philosophy, sociology, theology, everywhere the common theme is uncertainty. And one of the best examples that you have is coronavirus mutation. It is difficult to predict, and that is the nature of nature. And that's what Darwin also recorded in his writing, Origin of Species. Variation is the feature of the nature. So all across, this is the phenomena of uncertainty. And this uncertainty is occurring because of the interconnectedness, because of the interdependence of these different actors, actants, living, non-living entities, as well as the natural forces. So all of these are interacting simultaneously, and they are interdependent with each other, and they interact, and no one has any control on this outcome of this on the interactions per se. But we have a role in determining the outcome of the interactions. But interactions would take place. If you take features on the left-hand side, it will interact in that way. If you put it on the right-hand side, it will interact in that way. But so much for now, more in a separate lecture. This is a theme which is what I work on, and which I will be henceforth focusing more and more. So given all these 9 steps, if you get some sense of it, then you will appreciate why this architecture would work. So the FPOs at the GP level is what is recommended. Even in the policy, it is there. That part is correctly put in the policy. FPOs, the primary producer companies, should be at the Gram Panchayat level. That's all is suggested. Of course, it says 1 to 2 GPs at most, because I was able to convince to a large extent, but still some thought, no, at least 2 GPs. So it has been mentioned as 1 to 2 GPs. 1 GP is enough. Actually, the details are there. The commercial viability has also been calculated, and they have been, based on that, it has been mentioned there. And then after the primary activities at the primary production activities at the GP level, FPO at the GP level, then you have these value addition activities at the block level in a district. So if you have cashew, if you have pepper, if you have banana, some regions will be producing more than the other. So in that specific region, you put a processing unit for the whole district. Higher value addition for increasing shelf life of the product. So the marketability is better. But 80% of the produce actually is produced or is consumed within that local community at the GP level. The surplus from each Gram Panchayat or FPO actually go up to the block level for value addition for the district. One item in one block. Typically, a state has 12, 14 blocks, and you will have 14, 15 main crops, and you can have value addition facility. Not every block having all production facilities. There's no need of wastage of resources. You will not have the supplies, sufficient supplies to keep it running for the whole year. And then you do the marketing at the district level. The surplus of that, the value added, can also go back to the village. and the surplus from each can go up to the district, and that can connect to global markets. You have the size to negotiate with the global markets, but you don't have the size at the GP level, at the FPO level to negotiate with the markets. And today, for instance, pulses, dal, arhar, travels almost 2,000 kilometers from the producer and gets back to the producer. The producer sells at 40 rupees and pays 200 rupees when he buys it. So this is the transaction loss. That is why it is X to 4X, 5X is occurring, and no one in the value chain actually is making money. They don't make more than 10 to 12%. So it's a huge, huge loss for everyone. It's not a good model that we have. Of course, the trader is actually making money because of the volume, not because of margin. So I will stop here, Professor Deva. It can go on and on, but I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Amar. It was excellent, excellent presentation. With like quite happy to hear the aspect of convergence and other aspects coming into picture. And I was actually quite interested to look at the right side of the chart we are looking at. I just want to raise a point, but before that, I'll just look at the chat, and I've seen a couple of questions have come up. So I just take that question and move,
Yes.
and then come to my points. So just to quickly consolidate the questions which has come up. So the questions are basically raising the issue of how do you look at the institutional arrangement and the need for financing, as well as the need for awareness, I think education or awareness aspect along with trust. So how do you look at that in the FPO context, in the governance aspect?
So there is this element or the dimension for institutions in that chart. Right. What is the question about? Is it about that kind of understanding of institution, or banks for credit as institutions?
I think it's actually, it's just raising the aspect of institutional arrangements only, the weak feedback.
Oh, it's referring to regulations.
Regulations, yeah, regulations part.
So one of the things that you see, if you look at that chart, it says external loading, institutional loading. Now, this is what has happened. So the NABARD or SFSC or government, state government would actually direct what people should do. So there is a heavy external institutional loading. If you have that, you are actually curbing the participatory nature of the group. This is where the issue of balancing social capital with financial capital. So if you have regulations from outside, it will reduce trust. So you have to allow people to come up with their own regulations. So that institution has norms and values, rules and regulations. When you have norms and values, they are of the local community, of the members. And we have to respect, as outsiders, we have to respect those norms and values. So that is written as contextual on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side is written universal. Suppose my values, does self-regulation in a large setting.
I think
self-regulation. So now that is about you have to distinguish between regulation and norms. Regulations are rules and regulations, formal rules and regulations. That's going into the field of studying institutions. It also includes norms and conventions. So norms and conventions are something that has to be respected. And Ostrom also talks about that.
But the community norms and community
norms. And so that is where external loading should not be to disrupt the norms and conventions. But you need rules and regulations as well. Right. So rules and regulations are universal. Right. And you also need to have norms and conventions. So you have to distinguish between these two and then see which has to have an universal standard and which has to be contextual in nature. So that's mentioned in the institutional dimension. So for those of you who want to see that, is very much there.
Right. So So
there are separate papers also in the website on institutions. You can look it up. Look it up.
I think you can actually, I think your sender website actually have all that.
Thank you, Umesh. Yeah.
So I think that your sender's paper have sender's website have all the papers
Yeah.
material, right? I think I'll try to share that website link in the chat. So just there's one interesting point where I just want to take it forward. The questions from Umesh and the response from you. I just want to ask this interesting question. While formalizing the FPO structure under the Companies Act, are we actually touching upon this balance issue which you are talking about in the context of
yeah, it was not thought of. It was Professor Alag committee which was formed to facilitate this. In the internal inside story is different. It was not thought in this manner.
right.
So there was JJ Irani also in the committee.
Okay, right.
And they wanted, actually, there was problem in Amul. So NDDB actually wanted to convert this cooperative to a company. Okay. And they said, look, we need to have the cooperative features and put it in the company, so it is out of the government reach. So it didn't come up with a systematic understanding and knowledge. So, but it has some features, fortunately, of the cooperative. So not that I have interacted with Professor Alag, and he has a great respect to this work. It was not conceived in the way we are discussing now. It was actually brought in as a way to deal with the challenges that was faced in the corporate sector. Right. So the current policy of the government, or national policy guideline, allows for registration as a cooperative as well as a company. The first preference I mentioned is for cooperative. And in fact, it is better to be cooperative at the grassroots level. And then at a district level, you can register it as anything. Because it has the size, it has the negotiating power. It's not in the registration format which makes it sustainable or unsustainable. It is the governance structure inside and the management processes inside which makes it successful or unsuccessful.
Yes, thank you, Professor. I think I'd actually gone through your paper, which mentions about the policy issues. Actually, the top management structure actually sometimes becomes problematic when you actually look at this kind of a model for FPOs, right? I think the institutional structure where the top management actually, if you look at from the Companies Act perspective, it is totally you're trying to transplant something which is may not be like adequately suited for this purpose as such, right? Yes, I think that's
it's true. In fact, we have tried even putting executives who are from good institutions and hoping that they have better understanding of business. But most cases, in all cases, in my case that I've seen, they have not worked. Okay. What is working is local youth. If they can run business, running business is not very rocket science. It is a simple keeping of accounts and trust, sincerity, hardworking, and it's just manage your the red book. You'll be fine. If you manage your ledgers in the red book entries correctly, do the entries, it can be done at the end of the year. So it does not require, the MBAs are actually not the right kind to run FPOs.
Interesting to hear that. I'm not very sure how our MBA students would be interested to hear that point.
No, we don't train them. We train them on the left-hand side.
Right. Yes. We do that.
So how can you expect them to go and deliver something else?
True. That's
we
true.
Train them on the left-hand side. So then it's not their fault. It is our fault.
Yeah, it's actually basically the way which we look at, or we actually teach and train them. Yeah, that's where I think it's the issue, right? So I think any more questions coming up from the participants? I think that questions have been answered. Professor, actually just want to check one more point. Actually, how do you actually look at the point of a sustainable funding, which you talk about and from this chart which you mentioned about? How do you look at sustainable funding? Because as of now, there's some hand holding for around initial period which they get, but after that they are left off their own. FPOs to actually they have to find out the compliance as well as the funding. All these issues are left to themselves. I think how do we actually navigate that issue? Where do we get actually that part of as in convergence of all these factors will help them to come out of that, or what exactly we need to do in the policy or the governance structure there?
Yeah, if you look at the funds available, if you study the funding that goes into a Gram Panchayat, on an average, it is almost 2 crores. 2 crores per year. Now, it is not rooted, it is rooted individually, or is a mechanism to extract some money out of that process. But if you root a part of it through an institution of the people, one institution, you have enough and more money. And the transaction that occurs in a Gram Panchayat is almost at least 2 crores per month. So they are also not working together. So they're losing all their capabilities. So the key resource is actually with the people, not outside. Government doesn't have the resources. No government has the resources. And it is with the people, but they're not together. So this money has to be invested to get them together, not break them, not divide them. Yes. And division is not political division, but more in terms of the engagements of transactions that you organize. The schemes that you put in, you have different departments giving different schemes, different provisions. These needs to be converged and rooted through the FPO.
Right.
An entity, you may call it XYZ, but an entity which is in one unit through which a single window through which the whole Gram Panchayat people are relating to or connected to.
Right.
So then in that case, there is enough resource. But no amount of banking, credit linkage will actually help.
But apart from the initial point, I don't think it will.
No, it's not going to help, because what we promote is individual greed.
Yes.
And that is creating distrust. But you need trust for these systems to function.
Right. The social capital part, I think, need to be actually looked at.
So that is, in fact, when I started researching on it, I thought social capital has 20% weightage and economic viability is 80%. Today, I see there's no need of economic. You just build social capital, economics will produce. And that's linked to the point I said, interaction as a nature, as a critical or a universal feature of nature. It is in interaction that you produce resources.
Right.
Resource is not the cause of resource.
Right. Yes.
Resource is not the cause of resource, actually. But we understand in business as resource is the cause of resource.
Correct.
It's actually interaction which is the cause of creating resource.
Right. That's very, very interesting. Actually, I think we need to rethink certain of the ways in which we look at FPOs from our eyes. Totally different perspective. We try to look at FPOs. So I think it's very interesting to hear that point from you, Professor. So I think in case there is any more questions, I think we can look at that. I think there's some questions coming up. There's one more question.
Yes, you're right. Umesh has given a comment there. That's right. That's the aggregation effect that we have. But they need to, if at all, if you have to invest, we should be investing in building the social capital. That's all. And remove your external loadings. But that's not easy to give up because we want to be in control.
Right. I think, yeah. Yes, I think, Professor, I think then we can actually, wrap up the session. I think it's, thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.